There is a kingdom most history books never taught you about. A kingdom that fielded armies of thousands. A kingdom whose cavalry made entire empires flinch. A kingdom that traded gold, salt, and iron across half a continent. And when diplomacy failed, sent warriors who left no doubt about who was in charge. This kingdom did not fall because it was weak. It fell because the world forgot to remember it. Today, we bring it back. This is the story of the Dahomey Kingdom, the West African empire that built one of the most feared military forces in pre-colonial Africa, shocked European slave traders and colonizers alike, fielded an elite corps of female warriors the world had never seen before, and stood as a living, breathing proof that African civilization was never the passive, stateless landscape that colonial history pretended it was. Sit down, because this is one of the greatest military and political stories never told. To understand Dahomey, you have to understand the geography. The kingdom of Dahomey rose on the Abumi Plateau in what is today the southern region of the Republic of Benin. This was not a barren backwater. This was fertile land, a corridor between the dense forests of the south and the open savanna of the north, sitting close to the Bight of Benin, one of the most strategically important coastlines in West Africa. The Fon people, the ethnic core of the Dahomey Kingdom, had been organizing politically in this region since at least the early 1600s. But it was around 1625 that the founding of what we recognize as Dahomey truly began, when a prince named Dako, and later the legendary King Hugbaja, began centralizing power, absorbing neighboring groups, and constructing a court system sophisticated enough to manage a growing empire. The name Dahomey itself carries weight. One origin story says it comes from the phrase Da's belly, Da being the name of a rival chief whose stomach, legend says, became the foundation on which the royal palace was built after he was defeated. Whether literal or symbolic, that story tells you everything you need to know about how Dahomey announced itself to the world, with confidence, with conquest, and without apology. By the mid-1600s, Dahomey was not just a collection of villages. It was a centralized monarchy with a royal court, a tax system, an organized bureaucracy, and an army. Most West African states at this time relied on seasonal levies, farmers who picked up spears when needed and went back to their fields when the fighting was done. Dahomey rejected this model entirely. King Agaja, who ruled from 1718 to 1740, was the architect of Dahomey's military expansion. Under his reign, the kingdom built something rare in this era: a standing professional army, trained year-round, loyal to the throne, and capable of rapid deployment. Agaja used this army to dramatically expand Dahomey's territory, conquering the neighboring kingdoms of Aleda in 1724 and Ouida in 1727, bringing the kingdom direct access to the Atlantic coast and, crucially, to the trade routes that ran through it. But here is where the story gets fascinating. Among the warriors who served in Dahomey's armies, there was an elite corps unlike anything else in the world at the time: the Agoji. You may have heard them referred to in Western popular culture as the Dahomey Amazons, but that name was given by Europeans who couldn't quite process what they were seeing. The Agoji had their own name, their own identity, and their own terrifying reputation. These were women warriors, trained fighters, palace guards, and frontline soldiers who served as the personal army of the king. They were recruited from a young age, some as young as 8 years old, and trained for years in weapons, combat formations, endurance, and psychological hardening. Their training was brutal by design. They were taught to feel no fear. They practiced decapitation drills. They climbed thorn-covered walls as part of conditioning exercises. They were celibate, completely dedicated to their role, and lived within the royal compound. In battle, they were not support personnel, they were shock troops. European observers who encountered them in the 18th and 19th centuries were stunned. One British naval officer wrote that they fought with a ferocity and discipline that exceeded many of the male soldiers he had seen in his career. French colonial officers, when they finally clashed with the Agogi in the 1890s, reported suffering serious casualties from these warriors, even as the technological gap between French rifles and Dahamian weapons had grown significant. At their peak, the Agogi numbered anywhere from 5,000 to 6,000 warriors, a substantial fraction of Dahome's total military force. They were armed with muskets, clubs, and bladed weapons. They were organized into regiments. They had their own songs, their own insignia, and their own commanders. The Agogi were not symbolic. They were not ceremonial. They were combat soldiers, and enemies learned to fear them. But raw military power alone doesn't explain Dahome's longevity. The kingdom lasted for nearly 300 years. That requires something more than warriors. It requires political intelligence. And the kings of Dahomey had that in abundance. One of the most remarkable features of Dahome's governance was its dual administrative structure. For every male official appointed in the kingdom, every minister, every regional governor, every military commander, there was a corresponding female official given equal authority and responsibility. These women lived in the palace and reported directly to the king. They acted as a shadow government, a checks and balances system that prevented any single male power block from growing too influential. This was not a symbolic gesture. This was governance architecture, sophisticated, deliberate, and effective. The kingdom also developed one of the most comprehensive census systems in pre-colonial sub-Saharan Africa. Every few years, officials conducted surveys of the population, recording numbers of men, women, children, livestock, and agricultural output. This data was used to calculate taxation, military conscription, and resource allocation. This level of administrative sophistication rivals anything happening in contemporary European states. Dahomey also mastered tributary politics. As the kingdom expanded, it didn't always destroy defeated neighbors. It incorporated them, demanding tribute and loyalty while allowing local rulers to remain in place under Dahomey's umbrella. This created a network of satellite states that extended Dahomey's influence far beyond what its direct military presence could maintain. And then there was the question of the Atlantic trade. We cannot tell the story of Dahomey honestly without confronting this chapter, and it is a complicated one. Dahomey was a participant in the Atlantic slave trade. This is documented history, and it must be named. After conquering Ouida and gaining direct access to the coast, Dahomey became one of the most significant suppliers of enslaved people to European traders operating in the Bight of Benin, sometimes called the Slave Coast for exactly this reason. Captives taken in Dahomey's military campaigns were often sold to Portuguese, British, and French traders. By some estimates, Dahomey may have sold as many as 10,000 to 20,000 enslaved people per year at the height of this trade. The kingdom's economy became intertwined with this commerce. Revenue from the slave trade funded the royal court, the military, and the import of firearms that kept Dahomey competitive against its neighbors. Some historians have argued that Dahomey was caught in a brutal logic: raid or be raided, sell or be sold. The neighboring Oyo Empire to the north was a constant military threat, and maintaining the army that held Oyo at bay required resources that the slave trade provided. Others argue that this framing too easily excuses active participation in a monstrous system. Both things can be true. Dahomey was a sophisticated, powerful, genuinely impressive civilization and a state that participated in one of history's great crimes. This complexity is part of its full story, and a complete telling demands we sit with both. What we can say is that Dahomey's relationship with European traders was never one of submission. The kings of Dahomey negotiated hard. They set prices. They imposed tariffs. They expelled traders who violated their terms. In a trade relationship that was profoundly exploitative at the macro level, Dahomey operated with more leverage than almost any other African state on the coast. No story of Dahomey is complete without the Oyo Empire. Oyo was, for much of the 18th century, the dominant military power in the region. Located to the northeast of Dahomey, the Oyo Empire had what Dahomey lacked: cavalry. Oyo's horsemen were devastating on open terrain, and in a series of invasions beginning in the 1720s, Oyo repeatedly defeated Dahomey and forced the smaller kingdom to pay tribute. This was a humiliation Dahomey's kings never forgot and never fully accepted. Dahomey responded by adapting. Unable to effectively counter cavalry on open ground, Dahomey's strategists leaned into fortifications, firearms, and guerrilla tactics in forested terrain. They worked to acquire more muskets through the coastal trade. They constructed earthen fortifications around their capital at Abomey. They built up their own military reserves and bided their time. When the Oyo Empire began to fracture internally in the early 19th century, weakened by succession crises, overextension, and the devastating raids of the Sokoto Caliphate to its north, Dahomey seized the moment. By the 1820s and 1830s, Dahomey had stopped paying tribute entirely. By mid-century, it was raiding former Oyo territory. The student had outlasted the teacher. If Dahomey had a golden age, it came under King Gizo, who ruled from 1818 to 1858, one of the longest and most consequential reigns in the kingdom's history. Gizo came to power through a palace coup, overthrowing his brother with the help of a powerful merchant. But once in power, he was extraordinary. Under Gizo, the Agoji reached their peak numbers and prestige. He personally elevated the female warriors, giving them expanded authority, better equipment, and public honor. He reorganized the army. He expanded the kingdom's borders. He conducted military campaigns that brought in both territory and captives. Gizo also navigated an increasingly complicated international environment. By the mid-19th century, the British were aggressively pressuring West African rulers to end the slave trade, backing their diplomacy with naval power and economic incentives. Gizo met with British representatives, listened carefully, and gave answers that committed to nothing. He was too politically shrewd to make enemies of the British unnecessarily, but too economically dependent on the trade and too sovereign to simply comply with foreign demands. His court was famous for its ceremonial grandeur. The annual customs of Dahomey were elaborate public celebrations of royal power, parades, music, gift-giving, and public sacrifice. These events were political theater at its finest, reinforcing the king's divine authority and the loyalty of his subjects. Gizo died in 1858, possibly assassinated, possibly of illness. Accounts differ. But the kingdom he left behind was, for a moment, at the height of its power. The end When it came fast, and it came from Europe. France had been expanding its presence in West Africa throughout the 19th century, and by the 1880s, it had set its eyes on the region around Dahomey. The kingdom that now sat on the throne was led by King Behyansen, who took power in 1889 and immediately understood what French ambitions meant. Behyansen was defiant. When French forces began moving on Dahomey's territory, he refused to capitulate. He sought weapons from European arms dealers, including German suppliers. He modernized his forces as rapidly as he could. He appealed internationally, arguing that Dahomey was a sovereign state with the right to defend itself. The First Franco-Dahomean War broke out in 1890. The results shocked French commanders. Dahomey's forces, including the Agoji, fought with extraordinary ferocity. French soldiers reported being charged by the female warriors at close range, in the dark, screaming battle cries. The French suffered real casualties and were forced to pull back. France regrouped, brought in reinforcements, and attacked again in 1892, this time with a larger, better-equipped force led by General Alfred Amédée Dodds. The Second War was harder fought than the French had anticipated, but the technological gap was now too vast. French forces had modern artillery, repeating rifles, and virtually unlimited supply lines. Dahomey's warriors, no matter how brave, could not overcome that gap. Abomey, the capital, fell in November 1892. Behyansen burned parts of it himself rather than let the French claim it intact. He continued fighting as a guerrilla leader for another year before surrendering in January 1894. He was exiled, first to Martinique, then to Algeria, where he died in 1906, never returning to the land he had fought to defend. With his exile, the Kingdom of Dahomey ceased to exist as a sovereign state. It became part of French West Africa, its palace looted, its treasures shipped to Paris, its people absorbed into the colonial system that would not be broken until the independence movements of the 20th century. The Republic of Benin declared independence from France in 1960, and in the decades since, Dahomey's legacy has been gradually, powerfully reclaimed. The Abomey royal palaces are now a UNESCO World Heritage Site. The bronzes and carved artifacts looted by French forces have become the subject of intense international repatriation debates. France has begun returning some of these treasures, acknowledging what was taken. The Agoji have entered global consciousness in a new way. The 2022 film The Woman King, starring Viola Davis, brought their story to international audiences, imperfectly, with Hollywood compromises, but the world heard the name, and that matters. But the real legacy of Dahomey doesn't live in films or UNESCO plaques. It lives in the fact that this kingdom, on its own terms, built something extraordinary. A centralized state, a professional army, a shadow government of women who held real power, a diplomatic corps that negotiated with European empires without flinching, a military force that made colonizers bleed, even when they couldn't stop them. Dahomey was not a perfect civilization. No civilization is. But it was real, sophisticated, powerful, and deeply human in all the ways that word implies. The world forgot Dahomey because colonial history found it convenient to forget. Because the story of a kingdom this organized, this powerful, this strategically brilliant doesn't fit the narrative that was used to justify colonization. But forgetting is a choice, and so is remembering. The warriors of Dahomey trained in thorn fields and stormed enemy fortifications at dawn. They built a palace that still stands. They negotiated with empires. They gave their lives for a kingdom they believed in. They deserve to be remembered. If this story moved you, if you think more people should know what happened on the Abumi Plateau, share this video. Leave a comment about what surprised you most. And if there's another forgotten kingdom, another lost chapter of history you think we should cover, let us know below. The story of humanity is bigger than the version we were taught. We're just getting started.